Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Now, Liv, today we're talking about the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, which is the cross-party network of parliamentarians from more than 40 countries who share concerns about Beijing's behaviour at home and abroad. I say more than 40 because China has managed to peel away a few countries recently by putting pressure on the ruling parties in those countries, which gives you some idea of what they're up against.
But Australia continues to be well represented in IPAC. The Australian co-chairs are Senator Deborah Neal from the Labor Party and Senator Claire Chandler from the Liberal Party. Australia has been part of the alliance since it was founded in 2020. To tell us all about IPAC, today we have their Executive Director, Luke de Pulford.
Yeah, Luke is a human rights activist and anti-slavery advocate by background. He helped form IPAC in 2020. He explains how the group came together, the kinds of challenges it's faced and continues to face, both in terms of pushback from Beijing, but also just in how IPAC influences parliaments in their home countries on sensitive issues like human rights, not always an easy task, and how they generally look to shift the centre of gravity in those home countries on key issues.
Luke explains the way IPAC aims to talk about country sovereign interests rather than them being perceived as taking sides in great power competition between China and the US, the relative effectiveness of geopolitical coercion versus more benign influence, and the practical difficulties for middle powers in standing up to China when the US is retreating from its role in the liberal order.
Luke also talks about the recent conviction and sentencing of businessman Jimmy Lai, businessman and democracy activist, more importantly, Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, about Luke's native UK shifting positions on China relations, and about Australia's dilemma arising from having an economy heavily invested in China, but a security strategy fully invested in the United States.
Luke's a powerful speaker. He won't leave everyone uplifted, but these are important conversations, so we were very grateful to have him join us on the podcast. Over to you and Luke.
Luke de Pulford, thanks for coming on Stop the World.
Delighted to be here.
Let's get straight into it. I want you to start, please, by just describing the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China's mission, its format, how it got started, and how did you come to be leading the Secretariat?
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a delight to be here. IPAC was an interesting thing. It was really founded because there had been a broad realization from backbench, i.e. not governmental MPs, around the world, that their governments were not able to speak freely on issues related to China for various diplomatic, economic reasons, and that there needed to be some kind of vehicle to enable this issue, which was clearly cross-party and clearly went beyond people's borders, that enabled it to be framed in such a way. So IPAC sort of grew up around this idea that it wanted to create a space that showed that the China challenge was beyond party ideology and beyond geography. And it developed in that way. IPAC it's a unique institution in the sense that it's supposed to be a collection of politicians together who are determining their own consensus and campaigns, and who are, working together in a coordinated way to try to push their governments to reform their policy on China. So it's not about trying to make Beijing change its mind. It's about our own democratic governments forming an appropriate policy towards China. It's unusual in that way, and it has its own little constitutional foibles, which I can go into. But broadly, that's what it is. And IPAC is a framing institution. It's there to try to frame the debate around China using the tools that parliamentarians have. So either their platforms or their legislative tools, simply to force an appropriate, realistic debate on China. That's what it is in a nutshell. How did I come to be running it? Well, I had been running an anti-slavery organization, which had also started in 2015 with some philanthropic help. And I'd grown very frustrated in about 2017 by the unwillingness of the anti-slavery NGO community to speak about what was happening in the northwest of China to ethnic religious minorities there. This kind of led me to a bit of an epiphany moment, probably in about 2018, 2019, which was that the human rights questions as they manifested in China were fundamentally economic questions and could not be attacked in isolation. And the idea of IPAC grew out of that, really. So when it began, it was running on petrol fumes. It was a voluntary endeavor. I was doing it in the little spare time I had, and I was a sort of coordinator. And then it became more institutionalized, and it made sense for me to be running it. That's kind of how it happened.
Interesting. So, I mean, I noticed that you have bipartisanship and almost perfect numerical bipartisanship. It seems to be a specific sort of benchmark that you try to adhere to. So that's fantastic. I suppose when it comes to influencing their own governments and their own parliaments, rather than trying to have an effect on Beijing, which is perfectly understandable, it raises the question: well, how much success do you feel you've had on that front, and do you tend to attract, I suppose, political mavericks? And does that sort of create a sort of natural inhibition by those governments and those parliaments to, I suppose, accept the influence of those MPs? I mean, do you tend to get sort of outsiders who are campaigning on issues?
Yeah, I love this question because it really depends on the jurisdiction. And one of the great things about IPAC is that it's spread to all over the world. It started with 8 countries. It's now 44 parliaments. And I would say, if you were to ask me where is the strongest caucus, it's probably Japan. And the reason for that is that our director in Japan was very careful about who she brought into the network so that it would have the necessary clout. The idea is, within IPAC, constitutionally speaking, that a parliament can only come in if you've got 2 co-chairs and they have to represent one of the 2 sort of major political parties in that jurisdiction. So in its DNA, you've got the cross-party thing, and we focus on that very strongly. It's really important to demonstrate that, not because it's like a fun thing to do, but because IPAC strategy can't work otherwise. The idea is to shift the center of gravity of debate in that jurisdiction, and you cannot do that from really maverick places within a parliament. So in Japan, the figures who were at the helm of the thing were very well respected, very senior. And what built up around them was a group of parliamentarians who wanted to try to push together in this very bipartisan way to achieve change. And they've done that pretty successfully. In other places, it's a kind of beggars can't be choosers situation, because you might find that in certain parliaments, the space for, well, the ability to speak on China freely is very much reduced, and sometimes it can be reduced through heavy party discipline and a governing party that doesn't want you to speak out. So you might end up with a more maverick type member of parliament as your co-chair in that region. So it really depends. I mean, sometimes you get maverick folk, and they may not be as successful, therefore, in shifting the debate in that parliament. And sometimes it's not like that. Sometimes it's Japan, where when IPAC speaks, or JPAC as they call it, it carries serious clout, and it may well bring about a serious response from governments. I think to your main point, is it undermining of the vision? Well, certainly I think it can make the vision more difficult to express in that parliament, but it's much better to have a cross-party arena where people can speak than not have one. So our view has always been, if you've got to choose between slightly maverick folk or not having an IPAC, you go with the maverick folk because you need to have oxygen for those arguments in that jurisdiction, or you're not going to stand at any hope at all of shifting the debate. So yeah, I mean, the cross-party thing is extremely important. I think it's worth just digging into it slightly. The IPAC constitution is structured so that you have 2 co-chairs and then you have a membership beneath that. In some countries where the debate around China can be very febrile, can be very partisan, it's very important to have as close to parity between the main parties as possible. That's the case in the United States. So we kind of insist on strict parity in the United States, because the very last thing we want is a perception that this is a Republican issue or something. In Australia, we're fairly close to parity as well. And in some other places where the debate has been febrile and partisan for that reason. So we work on it really hard. But in some places, it's a huge hostage to fortune. So in many countries where we've been speaking about IPAC membership in Africa, where there is a strong desire privately, if you speak to politicians, they will tell you that they have strong concerns and they want to be able to express them. But it's very difficult to find people from governing parties willing to do that, because there simply isn't the political space to, because of the degree of leverage that the PRC might have over that governing party. So it's been really difficult for us to get people to be co-chairs from governing parties in some parts of the world, where there's been very heavy pressure from the PRC.
I'm interested in exploring that pressure a bit. Just tell me a little bit about what it's been like overall over the course of the 5 or 6 years that IPAC has been in existence. I've read that it has managed to strip members away from some countries, and the African ones, Malawi, the Gambia, and Solomon Islands in our part of the world. Tell us a bit about what's happened there, how they've managed to do that, and more broadly, what kind of pressure has IPAC felt from Beijing? I suppose not just IPAC, but parliaments around the world. I mean, what sort of approaches does Beijing use to try and dissuade people from joining an organisation like IPAC?
So we argue that there's a bit of a phenomenon of political transnational repression. And IPAC is the sort of sui generis petri dish for all of that stuff, because there's so much of it happening within the IPAC network all the time. It's a really broad portfolio of things, all the way from cyber attacks. There was a confirmed cyber attack on the whole of the IPAC network, happened in 2021. We didn't learn about it till 2024. Australian members of parliament were caught up in that. There has been individual harassment. I've had an impersonator for 5-6 years, stuff like that, a lot of online stuff. But the more worrying trend has been Beijing's weaponization of its diplomatic machinery to try to destabilize the network. And the way that they've done that is quite remarkable. A lot of this happened post our summit in Taipei in 2024, which they didn't like. And at that summit, we announced that Malawi, the Gambia, the Solomons, and a few other places had sort of acceded to IPAC. In the case of Malawi, what they then did is that they contacted the presidential office, this is the PRC, and they said, unless these guys leave this network, we're going to cancel the presidential visit from Malawi to China. And in a place like Malawi, with its dependencies, but also with its very strict party discipline, those guys had no choice. They had to leave. There was a similar pattern in the Gambia. We don't know precisely what happened there. The Solomons was a bit different. It was interesting, and in some ways it was more extreme. What happened in the Solomons was that the opposition member, he had decided to change allegiance after the crisis in confidence that there'd been in the Sols last year. And when he had done that, he received a letter, and the letter said, the condition for the PRC's engagement with your government is this. You leave this IPAC network, and then you make a public statement in support of the One China principle. So he had to leave. Now, we know that privately he hasn't changed his mind, but that's an extremely difficult position to put a place like the Solomon Islands in, especially when the relations with the PRC are as they are in that part of the world. But this has happened again. Recently, we just lost Zambia under similar coercion. So there's a lot of that going on, and frankly, it's not a fair fight. We were thinking about this today. IPAC has got like 10 staff and about 350 members of parliament. So we're already stretched way beyond our resources, but this is a very committed group of lawmakers by and large. 10 staff, and the CCP has in the region of 100 million members. It's not a terribly fair fight. Not only that, they have diplomatic apparatus that they're willing to use to try to crush what we're doing. What is interesting has been the response in Latin America, where they've attempted a similar thing. IPAC is growing very fast in Latin America right now. We just brought in Panama, including the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly there. And there's a lot of interest in other Latin American countries, big growth. And they've attempted the same thing. They've attempted the same kinds of coercion, the same sorts of threats. But the response has been very different. The response has been to consolidate the efforts of those Latin American lawmakers, to make them more determined to raise their concerns, which is an interesting thing in itself. It's backfired quite badly when Beijing has tried it there. So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
Quick question then. What prompted the growth in interest in Latin America in the first place?
I think it was the fact that an example had been shown by a couple of the early countries that had come in to IPAC. So this was particularly Paraguay, who came in early on, which would be understandable because of their existing diplomatic relations. But then Bolivia came in, and they started to make a real noise. And the politicians who joined from Bolivia were particularly vocal about some of the stuff going on around lithium mining and the very extractive, almost rapacious contracts that the PRC had tried to develop there. And they opposed them, and this was popular, their opposition of them, and in fact even led to a fist fight on the floor of the Bolivian assembly.
Fantastic.
Well, they managed to block the lithium contract, is the point. And what that did is I think it sort of held up a bit of a candle. Actually, no, we're not going to be treated like this.
Right.
We're not just going to be vassals. And I think it was partly that. And I think it was also the fact that they started coming to the IPAC summits and, finding friends across parties and across countries. And I think that camaraderie, that pointing at something which is, beyond your party allegiance, actually, and something which in some places is almost existential in terms of their political way of life, it brings about a kind of bond and commitment that is quite exciting and quite hopeful.
It's fascinating that coercion and bullying can go either way. Obviously, I mean, you talk about it backfiring. In some cases, the person on the receiving end might say, okay, you've got me, I've lost my confidence, I can't go through with this. On the other end of the spectrum, they say, screw you, I'm not going to be treated this way. You are making me even more determined to stand strong on my positions. Give me your thoughts, and based on your experience, of how that CCP approach actually works, and particularly works over an extended period of time. So the bullying, the wolf warrior diplomacy, these sorts of things. Now, you can frighten people into submission up to a point, but I mean, they're not going to love you for it, obviously. What do you think is actually more effective between the CCP approach and, I suppose, and at the risk of romanticizing the liberal democratic approach, the one that I hope that most of us in the West adhere to, which is to say, look, we observe a set of values that is good for everybody over the long term. We will explain to you why an open economy, why democratic values are good for your people. Ultimately, it's going to raise the standards of living for your people. So join us, please. We will make the case to you and then leave it up to you to decide. I mean, I'm going to take the second one if it's up to me, but I also recognize that over certain timelines, it might just be better to be feared than to be loved. And that might be more effective in geopolitics over a certain timeline that might actually be relevant to the kind of strategic competition that we're witnessing at the moment. What do you see in all of that?
So I think it's an interesting question because I think it's predicated upon, or at least framed around, great power competition. Or the notion there's a sort of systems conflict and you've got to pick a side. And I don't totally disagree with that because of the way that geopolitics is at the moment. But IPAC's argument has been slightly different here. What we've been trying to do, and we've been trying to do this through the lens of subsidiarity, which is important, but I'll come back to it. What we've been trying to do is say, this isn't actually about picking a side, people. This is actually about your own domestic interests. This is about your interests. And this is the thing which was so frustrating about what Macron had said a couple of years ago. We're not going to pick a side. We're not going to have a view about Taiwan. This is a US-China problem. We're not going to get involved. As if, I don't know, escalation and cross-strait tensions is something that France would be able to avoid. Completely absurd. In the same way that we would not want, I hope I wouldn't want the United Kingdom to stand up for its own values and interests purely because it thought that was the only way that it could pick America's side. Now, the geopolitical sort of realpolitik of the situation is, of course, the framing is very much closer to the pick a side framing, especially when you've got leaders behaving in the way that they are at the moment. But I would try to hold a candle for the possibility that people could just pursue their domestic interests and say, actually, that's why we're doing this. And when you have those kinds of conversations in Latin America, with Latin American lawmakers as I do, or with lawmakers across Africa as I do, all of them privately will tell you that. They won't necessarily say, we want to go the way of the US or we want to go the way of China. They will say, we want to go the way that seems to be best for our people, which necessitates standing up to the behavior of Beijing. And that's why they're doing it. I think that's much healthier. I mean, that isn't to dismiss your question, because it touches upon some of the really huge difficulties that we encounter. And the most disastrous conversation that we ever had within IPAC was a few years ago, and it was about Belt and Road. And it was convened by a bunch of the African lawmaker co-chairs. And they started it off by pretty much criticizing the US model to international development, saying, you're telling us that we can only feed our kids if we change our social policies. The Chinese come along and it all seems no strings attached. What do you expect us to do? Mm. And that's how the conversation began, and it only got worse from there for various reasons. So it's not as if that real political situation is not manifesting in places. Of course it is. But I do want to be the person who tries to appeal for people to actually just pursue their own domestic national interests. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. And that's why we're taking the approach that we are towards Beijing, not because we want to pick the side of the US, but because it's in our own national interests. And I'd be banging that drum until my dying day, I hope.
Right. Okay. So if we're talking about, I suppose, sort of sovereign decision making and allowing countries strategic options rather than forcing them to pick sides, what do you see as the trajectory at the moment in the great power rivalry between the US and China? I suppose historically I would have argued that the West has been less inclined to demand that a country picks a side. Going back to my previous question, it has been more about, okay, look, here are the advantages we believe that that the international system that we are supporting will afford you and your people, and allow a country to make its own decisions to pursue that course. I do think that under the Trump administration that has changed somewhat. I think there is more of a sense, particularly on economics and particularly on trade, in which the US is now saying, well, I mean, unless you adhere to the demands that we are putting on you, then you will experience some consequences. In fact, it's been pretty overt, frankly. What do you think of that, and what kind of impact has it had on the approach that you're taking, which is to try and encourage countries to have to maintain that sovereign decision making, those strategic options for themselves?
This is a huge question, and I think that it's actually quite difficult to answer it. And part of the reason it is that when we were building IPAC, we were dealing with the perception that was projected by Beijing that we were just lapdogs for American foreign policy. And in fact, when I was recruiting for co-chairs, particularly in the sort of French and European left, the refrain that we would hear is this a hawkish thing for Trump? Like, is that what you're trying to recruit us for? Is that what this is about? And we were strongly fighting against that perception. In fact, it's one of the reasons that the consensus areas that were focused on by IPAC in the early years were almost exclusively human rights, because that's where the consensus was. And I think it gave more left-leaning members the confidence to know that this cross-party thing was authentic and could be pursued. Where we are now is in a place where I guess the historical guarantor of the post-war consensus feels in the minds of many politicians throughout Europe as less reliable and less willing to be that guarantor, less willing to be that sort of character on the international stage. And that's caused great confusion and upset. It's particularly interesting in places like the Baltic states, who don't need any ideological persuasion when it comes to wanting to oppose what they see as communism. I mean, they're just there already. You don't have to have any of those subtle political framing arguments. They are already there, and would naturally incline towards supporting the United States for obvious reasons. They've been very badly shaken by the last year or so. I've never seen such a shift in overarching political allegiances as I have in that period of time. And I would be lying if I said that didn't present some challenges, because IPAC was built predicated upon things being beyond geography, beyond party politics. And what are those things, if not the post-war consensus, the international rules-based system, which has become almost impossible to talk about now? So those things, yes, they do present challenges. But the sort of saving grace is that the way that Beijing's behaviour has presents its own challenges to every other country. So the basic reason for IPAC obviously still exists. One interesting thought experiment around all of this, I was thinking about this recently, is to think, if China had not developed such huge monopolies in areas of critical infrastructure, if they hadn't inculcated the dependencies that they had, if they didn't have those choke points and points of leverage, would their behavior be tolerated, do we think? And would people be rushing towards China, or perhaps moving towards rapprochement in their international relations? And I think the answer to that question has got to be a resounding no.
Absolutely.
Because over the past 6 years, China have done a pretty good job of unmasking themselves. And I think there is much more realism about who they are. But it's a kind of begrudging, hold your nose realism, where everybody is still engaging because they feel they have no choice.
Yeah. Which I suppose comes back to my earlier point about timeframes. I mean, it seems to me that approach is not indefinitely sustainable, as a way to wield power and influence in the world. If you are essentially blackmailing people over some strategically acquired choke points that you have built up over time with the explicit intention of using them down the track in order to coerce other countries, I mean, you are just not making a lot of friends that way. And without genuine friendships and, I suppose, respect, which the US has, I would argue, earned over the sort of roughly 80 years post-World War II period, you are always going to be fighting a kind of a siege to maintain your own global influence. So I suppose it comes back to that. But then we come down to, well, what sort of timeframes are we actually talking about here? I mean, it could well be many, many decades in which that model remains effective for the Chinese Communist Party. And moving on, and look, I want to get onto some specific cases so that we don't just talk high level. I do want to get onto Jimmy Lai and a few other specific things in a moment, but I just have one more question on this sort of big picture area, and that is, during that time in which Beijing is wielding its power through coercion and fear quite effectively, and the US, for a number of complicated reasons, has retreated and presumably will remain in some form of retreat from its previous role for the foreseeable future. That leaves many other countries in just a practical difficulty as to how they invest time and capacity in some of those areas of principle that they might have felt more confident about fighting on, say 10 years ago. Human rights is a really, really good example. I think the diminution in profile of human rights in China over the past couple of years has been quite noticeable. I mean, leading from a certain position, Donald Trump, I can't remember literally ever uttering the phrase human rights, and I think that sets a tone for much of the rest of the world. Do you worry that for a lot of quote unquote middle powers like Australia, a slightly larger power like the UK, leaders simply feel that they don't have the political bandwidth or the backing of a more powerful friend to actually prosecute those sorts of issues of principle? How big a problem is that?
I think it's a big problem, and I think it's a problem which does exist. However, I wouldn't lay the blame solely at the door of the United States. It's quite interesting. My experience, I'm sort of a human rights background, really, sort of human rights guy. And in my experience, there has never been a human rights case that any government has been willing to pick up, has unilaterally picked up because they really cared about it. It's always what I would describe as kind of path of least resistance politics within foreign ministries when it comes to human rights. You've got to hold their feet to the fire to get anything out of them. The difference is that unilaterally speaking, countries other than the United States can't do a huge amount about it. Not only that, the guarantor for the human rights system is the United Nations, which is currently being retreated from by the very people it needs to support it. So for all of those reasons, it's much more complicated. I mean, we have had the occasional thing from Secretary Rubio about all this stuff. He was the inaugural co-chair of IPAC for the United States. So he does speak about it occasionally, but it's not framed in terms of respect for international overarching norms. And that's a big difference. It's noticed, and I think it does rather pull the rug out under the smaller nations who might otherwise, in other circumstances, have been willing to pick it up with a little bit more energy. So I do think there's an impact there, but it was never the case that governments were just willingly doing this stuff. It's just always excruciatingly painful to get them to do a single thing. And one of you asked a question right at the beginning about effectiveness of IPAC. Has it worked? And I think the answer to that is yes, as a framing institution, by throwing a lot of parliamentary grenades at governments a lot of the time. But it's changed the law quite a lot. And one thing that it did do was pass motions in 12 parliaments recognizing atrocity crimes against Uyghurs and other minorities in the northwest of China. And that definitely did make a lot of noise and reframe the debate around that issue, and did I think, contribute to forcing quite a lot of change. But I think you're right in pointing out that since then, what have we really heard about human rights in China? It's been pretty isolated. It's been initiated when it's happened almost exclusively by backbench politicians. And the response of governments has been muted. And that's certainly true. And probably for all the reasons you're pointing out. But I don't think that we are irreversibly on that trajectory. I don't think that that's the case. But yeah, maybe I'm being slightly too optimistic there.
I mean, it's fascinating what you say that very rarely have these stands been taken out of, I suppose, the goodness of people's hearts. Rather, it's a matter of people like you being more annoying than Chinese diplomats in getting into the foreign minister or the foreign minister's office's ears and giving them a hard time about it. And that's what ultimately wins the day on these sorts of issues. They feel they feel that their political interests are going to be better served by quieting the human rights advocates than in acceding to the pressure that they're getting from Chinese diplomats.
It's simply true, unfortunately, in my experience. And you've only got to think about what is almost certainly genocide in northern Nigeria, which nobody talks about, or what was a genocide in Myanmar, to point it out. Why weren't people talking about that in parliaments, and why was it that governments didn't do anything? Well, it's because there weren't really focused, annoying campaigns going on around. That's the way that it is. It shouldn't be that way, but it is the sad reality of the situation.
Yeah, that's okay. Look, you've as someone cursed with the affliction of lifelong idealism, you've given me something to think about there. Let's talk about Jimmy Lai then as a case study of some of the things that we're talking about. Just a bit of the quick case history for listeners and viewers. If I understand correctly, you've said that fabricated evidence was presented against Jimmy Lai that implicated IPAC, and with the intention of making Jimmy Lai's case appear like an instance of foreign interference, using him as a tool to try and to harm Beijing interest. Is that, first of all, is that approximately what happened?
Yes, it is. I mean, the background to it is that Jimmy Lai, media mogul in Hong Kong, who has willingly submitted himself actually to being in prison, knowing that he would be a peaceful pro-democracy advocate. He is the guy that they've decided to make like Bowser for anybody who followed like Nintendo and Mario and all that stuff. They had to have a big bad guy to pin everything on, and they decided that was going to be Jimmy. He was going to be the person that they blamed for all of the international advocacy around Hong Kong and for the 2019 movement itself. But in order to do that, they needed to try to connect him with all of this work going on internationally, and indeed with the predominantly youth-led movement in Hong Kong. A brief aside here, just to say how completely ludicrous this is. I mean, for anybody who is familiar with the 2019 protests, they were pretty much run by people, to the extent they were run by anybody, people who were very frustrated by Jimmy Lai's generation of pro-democracy advocates, because they felt that they'd failed Hong Kong, that they hadn't succeeded in securing a decent enough democratic settlement for the city. So they really didn't like him, and they didn't like his newspaper, by the way. And the idea that Jimmy Lai was kind of marionetting millions of people on the streets of Hong Kong is silly, but also there was no real connection between him and our work. I met him once or twice, and I sent him a few text messages. In fact, one of the text messages they read out in court was an exchange where I send him a tweet and say, "Please RT." And he responds saying, "What's RT?" And then I have to say, "Retweet."
Right.
You know, this was an exchange in the courtroom.
Okay.
So their idea was Jimmy Lai was behind this whole IPAC thing.
Yeah.
Jimmy Lai was behind the 2019 protests. And in order to fabricate, develop and build up this fabrication, they included a whole load of totally spurious evidence, and they included the evidence of a former volunteer of ours who was sadly mistreated, tortured in a Chinese prison, and agreed to become a prosecution witness against Jimmy, in order to create the perception that Jimmy Lai was behind the whole thing, some sort of CIA type guy who was being resourced to destroy Hong Kong, to ensure that people would impose sanctions against it and to bring unrest to Hong Kong. So that's what they've done with him, and they've convicted him for it. But this is entirely fabricated. Jimmy Lai never had anything to do with their work. And when I say anything, not a single thing. It's made up. The torture of Andy, I find very difficult to speak about. But Andy had no choice but to go along with their narrative. And as I've mentioned, the idea that Jimmy was somehow controlling millions of people on the streets of Hong Kong is self-evidently silly, ludicrous. But that's what they've done, because they needed to have somebody to blame. And it's also for that reason that I knew he was going to get a harsh sentence. Because what people have to understand about the Communist Party of China is that its power, its authority is unchallengeable. It cannot be challenged. It cares about that more than anything else. It's got to a point now where its understanding of Chinese identity is almost concomitant with the future and survival of the party. Jimmy Lai needed to be blamed in order to delegitimize the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. They cannot let him out for that reason. And I wasn't at all surprised that the sentence they imposed on him meant that he would have to die in prison.
Well, and it had to be portrayed as an Anglo-American plot where, Jimmy himself was being treated like a marionette and then was in turn having that effect on protesters. So what do you make of then? I mean, give us your response to the international response to Jimmy Lai's prosecution or conviction and sentencing. How far short, in your view, was it of the sort of response that you would have liked to see?
Well, as far as the UK is concerned, I think the UK has most to answer for, because we, obviously, with China, were signatories to the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which was supposed to guarantee a high degree of autonomy for the people of Hong Kong until 2047, at least. And we now say, the UK's language around this is that China is in ongoing non-compliance with the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is a polite way of saying they've torn it up and don't care about it at all. Now, normally, when somebody does that unilaterally to a treaty, there are some steps towards accountability. The UK has not taken a single one. Indeed, it's now turning up to Hong Kong with a begging bowl, if anything, just rewarding China's treatment of that agreement and their treatment of the UK and of the promises that they made. But the UK had promises too, and it didn't enforce them. It didn't even seek to enforce them. It didn't even register an objection about the treaty violations. It was all deeply pathetic. In fact, what they ended up doing was this very good policy to welcome Hong Kongers who wanted to leave, but it is in effect a surrender policy. That's what the UK has done. Now, when it came to Jimmy Lai's conviction, which in itself is a breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, just on its own, the UK issued a hand-wringing statement. This is a British citizen. Jimmy Lai is British. He's only ever had a British passport. And the government weren't even going to make a statement on it. It was truly remarkable. They had to be dragged to the House because Sir Ian Duncan Smith secured an urgent question. So I was very disappointed with that. But they weren't alone. The statement from the government of Canada was really appalling. We're a little bit disappointed was kind of what it said. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. You can look at it. It was the language was not appropriate to the degree, to the scale of the cruelty and to the profile that Jimmy has had. I mean, Jimmy sacrificed himself in order that the media spotlight would be shone on Hong Kong and that Beijing would be unmasked. And his case has achieved that, but not in the way that he'd hoped. I think he'd hoped that there would be an international response. In fact, Beijing's cruelty has been unmasked, and the weakness of international governments has also been unmasked. So yeah, please.
Well, so I suppose let's play it out the way you would have liked. Let's say the UK, expressed very strong language around this, and the CCP said, "Go jump." And by the way, here are some economic measures that we are seriously considering levelling against you. Isn't this an instance where, I mean, the Sino-British Joint Declaration, wonderful thing in 1997. Now that we're in the second half of that 50-year period to which it applies, the realities of power now, noting that those sorts of stands need to be buttressed by real power, the UK simply doesn't have a lot of options to enforce, whatever strong language that it actually might have chosen to use had it wanted to be more courageous. What do you say to that reality?
Yeah, well, I think you're accurately depicting the problem, but the solution to that, I don't believe, is to say, well, in that case, screw all of our treaty promises. Doesn't really matter. The response ought to have been to seek how the UK could have used its influence with other like-minded allies who themselves are worried, have been expressing concern about the Jimmy Lai situation. Now, many foreign ministries have just seen it as an inconvenience. It's a bit annoying that they have to deal with it because, frankly, it gets in the way of what they're really interested in, which is trade and investment. But had the UK sought to do that, then it could have achieved something. There are many diplomatic levers that the UK could have used and did not use. For example, on the Prime Minister's recent visit to Beijing, we had conceded this totally disastrous mega embassy before we even went. Now, I would not have been in favour of giving them this embassy at any point for any reason, but the Prime Minister could have said, "You're going to have to give us Jimmy if you want the embassy." Did the UK do anything like that? Well, no, it didn't. In fact, all it's done is signal capitulation and cowardice. So my view about it would have been, okay, we are now pretty far down the line of having not done anything when it's come to violations of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and to suddenly rear our heads would be quite difficult. I would have hoped, and I campaigned even back then, that the UK would have got together with like-minded allies and said, actually, this treaty, which is lodged at the United Nations, is something we have a common responsibility to defend, and the UK cares enough about it and enough about its promises to the people of Hong Kong to do that. But it didn't. It didn't do anything, nothing, not even any unilateral steps towards accountability. And I think that's just shameful betrayal of the people of Hong Kong. So you're right to point out the issue. I think the UK on its own, it's a middle power. It doesn't have the authority that it once had. And it cannot, I think, go around unilaterally imposing consequences in a way which is going to be meaningful to a country like China. I think that's true. But I do not think that that means that it is powerless to do anything at all. And I think that it could have sought multilaterally with like-minded allies who cared about Hong Kong as well, and who also had a responsibility to defend that treaty, and not just that treaty, also the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to which Hong Kong was a signatory. It could have tried to broker some kind of mutual step towards accountability that might have made Beijing think again, but it didn't do any of that.
Right. So if the reports are correct, the negotiation went more like if you don't give us the embassy, then your visit to Beijing isn't going to happen. You don't get to stand up and say we are creating economic opportunities for the British people, and I suppose the parachute that you're hoping to have to rescue you from the fairly sort of parlous economic and political circumstances you find yourself in as a government will have a great hole rendered in it. So that's the option that we're putting to you. I mean, first of all, does that seem like a plausible way that it went? And I mean, putting myself in Keir Starmer's shoes then for a moment, and this is, I mean, not to focus on Starmer specifically, but I think this is emblematic of the dilemma that a lot of leaders are facing right now. That the world is a very, very tough place. For the first time, we're looking at our kids' generation having a lower standard of living than ours, which is kind of a reversal that we hope never to happen through history, but that seems to be the way things are headed. And if you're the leader of a country, you have to think about the broad interests of your people. And so these are the sorts of trade-offs that you're just going to have to make. Sorry, Jimmy. Is that, I mean, what would you say to that?
Well, I don't think that from the United Kingdom's point of view, the economic arguments are in favour of that position. And I think this is quite an important point to make, because I think when you introduced that question, I think you expressed what most people think about China, which is they hold all the economic cards. You need those cards. So you're just going to have to bend to that will to a certain degree anyway. Like, what use is it if the Prime Minister can't even get a trip to China or that kind of thing? I don't think that we're in the place that we were 10, 15 years ago, back when China did FDI in a little bit more of a concerted way. And back when the UK didn't have quite the trading deficit that it does with China right now. Or back before the British Steel debacle, when we realised why it was perhaps that China's investment in the United Kingdom was skewing so heavily towards critical infrastructure, with the risks far, far outweighing the benefits. We're just not in that place anymore. So had I been advising the Prime Minister, I would have said, look, what is the economic case for you to make all these concessions actually? Is it the case that Beijing is going to present the kind of economic sticking plaster that's going to enable you to make a political pitch to the British people? I do not think that's the case. And in fact, as far as I can make out, the consensus of economists is with me. But there is a strong hardcore of what I would call kind of golden era enthusiasts within His Majesty's Treasury and a couple of senior officials, including the disgraced Peter Mandelson, who was very strongly influential over current government policy on China, who are holding on to this vision, you know. And their idea is China is going to be the globally dominant economy. You're going to have to rub along with it. You may not like their values, but you don't have any choice. You've got to get along with it. And by the way, why don't you try to secure some preferential trading arrangements in the meantime? That's the sensible, pragmatic thing to do for the British people. That's their argument. It's not an argument that stacks up anymore. It might have stacked up in 2010, but the economic predicates aren't there anymore. So that would have been my argument. And I would have said to the Prime Minister, why are you making these concessions? You know, when the Chancellor returned from Beijing, from her visit, she came back with £600 million over 5 years. Nothing. Less than the Chinese want to spend renovating the embassy. When the Prime Minister came back, he came back with practically nothing. Even Carney, when Carney came back, and from a much more successful trip, he came back brandishing a bunch of MOUs, which I can fairly confidently predict will not materialise. So I think we're getting to a point now, and maybe this is sort of bringing us back to where we started. We're getting to a point where we're in the dying gasps of what is, I think, an obsolete understanding of what engagement with Beijing is going to bring. It's being proven to be obsolete. And once the economic arguments start to fail, which they are doing now, I think governments will have to change course. I think that we will not have another golden era government after this one. This is the last one. Certainly, that's where the parliamentary consensus is, the consensus in Fleet Street and in the country. So I can't see it continuing. And I think that the more that Beijing withdraws, unmasks the fact that it's not really actually there, it doesn't intend to assist other countries economically in the way that perhaps they might have hoped, the closer that we're going to be towards a realistic position on China.
Okay. Can you move that to Australia as an example? And look, fine if you don't want to go there for one reason or another. But let me just outline a couple of thoughts to you. The situation for Australia is that China is our largest export destination. We send huge amounts of raw materials there, and that's a large source of national income for us. In terms of the economics, I mean, that's really the argument that is foremost. And China has demonstrated that it is prepared to impose penalties on us for under spurious trade measures, as they did during the sort of 2020 to 2024-5 period. Notably, they didn't apply it to things that they really need, like iron ore and coal, because that would have been too self-defeating. They did it on the things that they could afford to do it on, like lobsters and wine, certain grains and this sort of thing. So I guess that's an interesting part. But I mean, can you give us a sort of broad comment on how you see Australia's position, and are we right in thinking that they hold the economic cards in that way, in a way that we simply have to accept?
Well, certainly Australia is much more exposed than the United Kingdom, and we're really not comparable in that sense. And you point out, I think, some very important things. I was personally encouraged by the way that Australia did manage to weather the attempted economic coercion from China. And it was encouraging to see other countries, to the limited extent that they did, try to rally round. But it was also true that at around that time, when they put, I think it was 220% tariffs on wine back in, must have been, was it 2020? Was it that long ago? It's a long time ago now. Yeah, it must have been 2020.
That was when 2020, maybe 2021, but I think 2020 was when a lot of the things came in.
Around that time, obviously in response to the request for an investigation into the origins of COVID, it was the late, great Senator Kimberly Kitching who said to me, it's probably not going to happen again. We jumped out in front of the dragon and you all left us alone. And there was a sense of that. I think there was a sense of that. Back then, certainly in Five Eyes, with the exception of the United States of America, of the middle economies, Australia was way out, and trying to set the standard and trying to push other governments to do the same. And being exposed like that is not much fun. And when people don't come to your aid, we've seen it with Lithuania as well. You may have heard the recent comments from the incumbent leader, who just said, "No, we're not going to do this again. This stuff around the Taipei representative office, which provoked China, was a stupid thing to do. Why did we do it? Right. You just left us alone. We were on our own." And what that does is, I think it underlines something which is very important in answer to your question, which is that if there cannot be any kind of democratic dividend, if there can't be any benefit to being a democracy and trading with other democracies, then what's the point in us, really? If there can't be solidarity when we're facing an authoritarian state which is deliberately inculcating dependencies in order to be able to bring about the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, by which they mean prevail over the United States, become the global hegemon. If we can't have a situation where there is solidarity among democratic nations such that we can withstand that sort of thing together, then I think we've got some really serious questions to ask ourselves. So I'm completely with you. I think, New Zealand, Australia, a number of other regional countries, extremely exposed. They have different decisions to make than the ones that the United Kingdom and some other economies have to make. The United Kingdom has no excuse, I believe, for the posture that it's currently taken. But what I would say, without hopefully ruffling too many feathers or speaking beyond my brief or speaking as somebody engaging in foreign interference, we do miss the leadership that we had from Australia.
Okay. Interesting. I mean, it feels we're a long way. I can remember not that long ago, serious people talking about something like an Article 5 on economic coercion. You talk about solidarity, and if we can't have that around values, then what's the point? I mean, I just feel as if, and look, I'm going to finish. I'm going to finish in a moment because I realise the time's getting on. But I mean, I feel as if we're just a very, very long way from that sort of confidence that we might have had a few years ago. So, I mean, that's a comment on your comment. But perhaps to finish, can you give us where do you see the areas of hope? Is there do you see any prospects for a regaining of a collective principled stand on authoritarianism globally? Do you see any isolated instances that give you optimism? Takeichi's huge electoral success in Japan sticks out to me. I mean, basically, she made some supportive gestures towards Taiwan. China imposed penalties on Japan as a result of that. She holds an election, and the Japanese people said, "We adore you. We're giving you a supermajority." I mean, that seems to be instructive in some ways for me. Give us some hope to finish.
Okay, some hope without getting too much into the weeds of, I don't know, jargon. I think that we are heading towards a place of kind of unconscious regulatory alignment. What I mean by that, bear with me, is that we have legislated ourselves into a place around human rights, around due diligence, around the environment, where we're going to make it very difficult for China to be able to satisfy the sorts of standards that we have created, like, for example, around labor and around the environment. If you're buying renewables from China, not only are you actually harming the environment, but you're also most likely exposed to forced labor. And the rest of the democratic world, which is interested in this kind of thing, is going to find itself unwittingly harmonizing around all of that. And that is going to lock out authoritarian states over time. We'll get there eventually. So that's one area of hope, which I think is already starting to yield. I find it quite interesting. Another area of hope I would point towards more immediately is in Latin America. There's real energy there, and the energy has not come from a place of being sort of a proxy United States, and it hasn't actually come as a result of strongman leadership from the United States or from China. It's grown from domestic interest. And I think as we see concern around China translate much more into the language of national interest, we're going to see big problems for the way that Beijing's grand plan plays out. And that is a sign of real hope for me. The fact that Panama, which was under a seriously coercive situation itself, has decided not just to join our network, but to start making real noise in their parliament, really encourages me. I think there's a lot of encouragement to be taken. We are in a place now, I think we should be clear about this, where the economic promises or the economic predicates that we labored under, these misapprehensions that we all thought were true about China, have been exposed not to be true. And over the next few years, I think will be very clearly not true. And as they prove not to be true, all of the rest of the behavior of Beijing then comes into much starker relief. And nations are able, again, I hope, to say, no, this is what we stand for. This is who we are. And regardless of however much pressure they might once have had, they actually don't have enough leverage to be able to coerce us to a point where we're not going to stand up for who we really are. And that encourages me, because I do see that end in sight. It's just pretty dark before dawn, I would say that.
Right. Okay. Well, we will certainly watch and hope. But look, Luke, best of luck with your work. Full of admiration for what you do. So good luck with it, and thanks for coming on Stop the World.
Great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening, folks. We'll be back with another episode soon.